Ready. Welcome to the Karma Army. Names and details have been changed, but the justice? Oh, the justice is real. It is so very satisfyingly real. I never thought I was the kind of person who would just sit there and let it happen. But that's the thing about this particular type of theft. It doesn't feel like theft at first. It feels like a personality clash. It feels like bad luck. It feels like maybe you're being too sensitive, too territorial, too quick to assume the worst. By the time you understand what's really happening, it's been going on for months. And a woman named Diane has somehow become the most celebrated person in your department without having done a single original thing. I'm going to tell you about the 18 months I spent watching Diane systematically dismantle my professional identity, and about the afternoon her entire constructed world came crashing down in front of 200 colleagues and a panel of directors. I joined the product team at a mid-sized software company about 4 years ago. It was the sort of place that uses words like culture and values in its job listings, which usually means either that the culture is genuinely good or that someone in HR has been on a course. In this case, it was genuinely good. A strong team, thoughtful leadership, work I found interesting and cared about doing well. I had come from a background in product analytics and data-informed design, which was exactly what the team needed. I threw myself into it. Diane had been there 2 years longer than me, and she had already established herself as what I can only describe as a professional surface. She was impressive from a distance. She attended every meeting and spoke in every meeting, confidently and at length, about work she hadn't done. She asked questions that sounded probing and insightful, but were, on closer inspection, just restatements of what someone else had said a few moments earlier, rephrased and delivered back into the room as if she'd arrived at them independently. She had the vocabulary of someone who had read a lot of product management theory without particularly applying it. She could talk about strategy for 45 minutes and not commit to a single concrete position. She had mastered utterly the art of being visible. I was, by nature, the opposite of visible. I put my head down, did the work, and quietly assumed the quality of the output would speak for itself. I'd always operated that way. I had never needed to be the loudest person in the room because I trusted that the room would eventually notice the work. It noticed Diane instead. The first time it happened, I actually gave her the benefit of the doubt, which, in retrospect, was a gift she absolutely did not deserve. I had spent 3 weeks building a new user onboarding flow, proper deep work stuff, wireframes grounded in user research, a synthesis of interview data, the full architectural logic of how new users would be moved through the first week of the product experience. I had presented it to our team lead in a Tuesday afternoon meeting. 2 days later, in a broader cross-functional call that included people from marketing, engineering, and customer success, Diane mentioned the onboarding work, casually, conversationally, as something she'd been developing with the team. I was on that call. I heard it. I said nothing. I told myself she'd misspoken. I told myself she'd perhaps meant it as a collective. She'd been loosely across the work. She was probably just being inclusive with her language. I gave her every possible interpretation that didn't require me to believe that someone would deliberately claim another person's work. I was not yet ready to be that cynical. She did it again 6 weeks later. A strategic brief I'd written, a proper document, 40 pages, source data, clear recommendations, surfaced in a director-level meeting as something Diane had put together. I only heard about it second-hand from a colleague who mentioned it in passing and seemed to assume I'd know. I hadn't known. I hadn't been invited to that meeting. I hadn't even known my document was being circulated until my colleague mentioned Diane's presentation of it. And then again after that. Each incident slightly more audacious than the last. Each one slightly more confident. Because each time it had happened and I had said nothing, she had been trained, gently, inadvertently, by my own silence, that this behavior had no consequences. I had been, without intending to, reinforcing the very pattern I needed to break. What made it worse, genuinely stomach-dropping worse, was the HR conversation. I went to HR after the third incident. I brought notes. I was careful and measured and professional, and I did not exaggerate a single thing. The HR representative was pleasant and attentive and absolutely, completely useless. She told me that attribution in collaborative environments can be complex, a sentence I have replayed in my head many times since, always with fresh irritation. She said she'd have a word with Diane's line manager. Diane's line manager, who happened to also be a close personal friend of Diane's outside of work, who had, I later learned, been one of the people in the director meeting where Diane had presented my 40-page brief as her own. I left that meeting knowing I was on my own, that no institutional process was going to fix this, that if anything was going to change, it was going to be because I changed it. So I did. I stopped being invisible about my work. Every piece of analysis I produced from that point forward was sent to my team lead with a direct email. Clear subject line, my name in the document, my name in the email, the date, a brief description of what it was and what it was for. I started speaking first in meetings. Not aggressively, not even noticeably, just making sure that when I had built something, I was the person who introduced it to the room. I CC'd relevant stakeholders on correspondence about my own projects. I shared documents via links that preserved version history and clearly showed who had created the file and when. I built a paper trail that was not subtle, not hidden, and not accidental. And I started watching Diane more carefully. Not with hostility, I want to be precise about this. With clarity. I watched how she operated. I noticed the rhythm of it. She would attend the meetings where work was being presented, absorb the details, and then find a different room, a more senior room, in which to present those same details as her own contribution. She wasn't brilliant at the work. She was brilliant at audience selection. She knew exactly which rooms mattered and made sure she was always in them, performing. The opportunity I hadn't planned for arrived in the form of the company's annual strategy showcase. This was the big one, an annual all-hands event, a full day where each department presented their major initiatives to the entire organization, including the executive leadership team and several members of the board. 200 people in the room. Careers made visible in that room. Reputations confirmed or revised in that room. Diane had volunteered to present on behalf of our department. Of course she had. The 2 flagship projects she intended to feature were mine. The onboarding redesign I had built the previous spring, and a product analytics framework, the most technically sophisticated thing I had produced at that company. I had spent 4 months developing from scratch. The methodology, the weighting logic, the implementation model, the measurement approach. Every decision had been mine. The document was 53 pages. It had my name in the footer of every page. I knew she intended to present both projects. I let her prepare for them. What she did not know, what I had not mentioned and had no intention of mentioning, was that one of the board members attending the showcase had reached out to me personally about the analytics framework the previous month. He had seen my name on an internal distribution of the document and wanted to discuss the methodology in more detail. We had exchanged 3 or 4 emails. He had asked intelligent, probing questions about specific decisions I'd made, particularly around how I'd chosen to weight the retention metric and how I'd accounted for edge cases in early cohort data. I had answered all of his questions in full because I was the person who had made those decisions, and I understood every single one of them completely. He knew whose work it was. Diane did not know that he knew. She stood up at the showcase with total composure. 200 people in the room, directors and board members in the front rows, and Diane was perfectly presented, confident, polished, professional. She walked through the onboarding project smoothly. She had absorbed enough of the surface detail to sound credible to people who hadn't built it. And then she moved into the analytics framework. She had barely cleared the second slide when the board member raised his hand. His question was specific and technical. He asked about the decision to weight the retention metric the way I had, specifically why I had chosen to apply a decay function rather than a flat coefficient, and whether I had considered the implications for cohort comparisons across the first 90 days. It was not a hostile question. It was an intelligent question. The kind of question you ask when you genuinely want to understand the reasoning. The kind of question you can only answer if you actually made the decision. Diane paused. It was a small pause. If you hadn't been watching for it, you might have missed it. I was watching for it. I had been watching Diane's face for 18 months, and I knew what I was looking at. She didn't know the answer. She didn't know the answer because she hadn't built the framework. She hadn't written the methodology. She hadn't spent the sleepless Tuesday night reworking the weighting logic because the first version didn't hold up across the validation set. She gave a vague answer. He followed up politely, asking her to be more specific about the reasoning. Her answer became vaguer. There was a quality to the silence in the room, a particular attentiveness that comes when a group of people simultaneously realizes something is wrong. He looked down at the table. He had printed the methodology document. My name was in the footer. He asked pleasantly and with great precision whether the person who had authored the original framework document was in the room. I raised my hand. He asked me to walk through the rationale. I did. I didn't rush. I didn't perform. I simply explained, clearly and completely, every decision I had made and why. Because I had made them, and I understood them, and I could have answered those questions in my sleep. The room listened. Diane sat down, and the space that opened up between what she had been performing and what I had actually built was visible to every person in that room who mattered. After the event, Diane's manager was called into a meeting. Then Diane was called into a meeting. Then I was asked to provide documentation of my contributions. I had it, all of it, organized chronologically, with timestamps, with version history, with email threads that clearly showed the development of every piece of work she had claimed. The investigation was not lengthy. The evidence was not ambiguous. Diane left the company 6 weeks later. I don't know the precise circumstances, whether she resigned or was asked to go, and I find I genuinely don't care to know. What I care about is this. 3 months after that presentation, I was promoted to a senior individual contributor role. The analytics framework was greenlit for expansion across 2 additional product lines. I was asked to lead the rollout. I was, for the first time in 18 months, properly visible, not because I had fought for visibility, but because the room had finally been arranged so that no one could stand between my work and the people it was made for. I think about what I learned from those 18 months, not the lesson about Diane specifically. She was an individual with a specific set of choices she made repeatedly and eventually paid for. The lesson is wider than that. Being quiet and letting your work speak for itself is only a strategy if no one else is speaking over it. The world does not reward invisible excellence automatically. Credit is not distributed fairly by default. You have to be the one who puts your name on things, sends the email, makes the introduction, says out loud what you built and why. It is not arrogance, it is accuracy. It is the basic act of claiming what is yours before someone else decides it's theirs. Diane had taken from people before me. She had operated this way for years before I arrived, and would likely have continued if no one had ever prepared the room properly. She relied on the silence of her targets. She had never met someone who had been quietly, methodically building a paper trail for 6 months before the reckoning arrived. She thought she was the one working the room. It turned out I had been working the calendar. Some lessons take an audience to land properly. If you enjoyed this story, hit like and subscribe for more Karma stories every week. End of script 06. The co-worker who took credit for everything.